Body, soul, spirit. On what the soul might be, an infinite number of books by the most important philosophers and theologians have been written, from the two fathers of philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, who had different ideas about what the soul might be, and these differences crossed the history of Western philosophy like a red thread. I don't intend to write a philosophical treatise on the soul, but simply to say what I believe the idea of the Cathars might be on this subject, on which there is unfortunately much confusion. The question of the soul is the most intricate, and a hodgepodge of ideas that springs from sources are such as induce many authors to present one of so many variants, being very careful not to add conflicting hypotheses into the chaos. The Cathars distinguished in man according to a doctrine that was current in the early centuries of Christianity, and expounded in particular by Origen, three components: body, soul, and spirit. Of spirit, page 105, soul and body, also spoke the Apostle Paul, but in the doctrine elaborated by Thomas Aquinas, soul and spirit began to merge, and after him the Church ratified that in man there was just body and soul. Today we are so used to it that we don't distinguish between soul and spirit, so it became difficult for us to grasp the difference. For the Cathars there was a difference, and it amazes me when an authoritative scholar like Francesco Zambon, having claimed that the Cathars distinguished between soul and spirit, and that such distinction is attested to explicitly in different sources, including Moneta himself, writes that the two terms can be used as synonyms of each other because spirit and soul are, in the last analysis, the same thing. The Inquisitor Moneta da Cremona is the author of the treatise Against Cathars and Waldensians, the scope of which was to expound the doctrine of the Cathars until the Inquisitors could recognize in their sayings whether they were heretics or not. The distinction between soul and spirit was heretical. Now, I ask myself, why did the Cathars ever insist on such a distinction, placing themselves in opposition to the official doctrine of the Catholic Church, risking the stake if they were, in the last analysis, the same thing? It doesn't make sense. Let's understand it. One of the most diffuse beliefs among the Cathars was that the spiritual part of man was an angel trapped in material, that is, in a body. The body was considered by all to be a prison for the spiritual part, divine, that is, the real essence of man that yearns to return to its own place, to the world of light from which it came, to God. The vision of the body as a prison for the soul was certainly not new. It was already in Plato, and before him in the Orphic Pythagorean tradition, and then in all Gnostic currents. And it is, evidently, also there in Dante, given that he writes, "The soul is bound and imprisoned by the organs of our body." As for how much it concerns the Cathars, there are obviously the usual variants, both on the problem of the angels falling through their own fault, or instead captured against their will, or on the strategies to recover these particles of light, and also too on the amount of fallen or captured angels, 1/100th of the total of the angels created, 1/10, 1/3, half, all. Page 106. Now, keeping in mind that these themes were exclusively Cathar, and certainly were not talked about among Catholics, one couldn't not get a jolt reading the banquet concerning the angels. One thing must not be left unsaid. I say of all these orders, some fell soon after they were created, a certain number, perhaps 1/10, for the restoration of which number human nature was afterwards created. Man would be created to restore the fallen angels. This is pure Catharism. It doesn't in fact remotely correspond to the doctrine of the Catholic Church, but it is part of the various hypotheses elaborated by the Cathars. It was instead accepted by all the belief that only a part of the angel was entrapped, that constituted the spirit of man, while another part, called the body of the angel, obviously not a material body, but a radiant body, spiritual, remained in heaven and acted as the guardian angel of the former. Both parts yearned to come together. According to another version, espoused by Zambon, the soul and the spirit are two halves of one reality that are divided in some way, and the part that is imprisoned in the material body of man is called soul. What remained in heaven is called spirit. This version doesn't convince me because if it were so, there would only be two components, body and soul, while the spirit would remain in heaven, while instead the presence within man of three elements is one of the cornerstones of Cathar doctrine. The fundamental question that we must ask ourselves is this: what difference is there between soul and spirit? This distinction is only present in the doctrinal systems that offer the reincarnation. Outside these, indeed, it makes no sense. According to Catholic doctrine, the soul is breathed into every single human being. If it is tainted by grave faults, it is destined for hell for eternity. Whether it's called soul or spirit, it doesn't change. It's different in the other system, where the spirit, whether it's of angelic origin or not, is in every case a divine spark, a part of God, and therefore cannot be tainted in any way. It is the soul that is stained, but however stained it might be, no hell is foreseen for it, but rather a series of reincarnations from which it purifies itself. Now all the doctrines, page 107, that envisage a difference between soul and spirit only consider the spirit immortal, and this complicates and confuses the question because the soul also survives death, given that it must be reincarnated and, we deduce, is immortal. But no, as absurd as it seems, that's not it. What keeps the spirit trapped in the body is the soul. In fact, if it were only the body keeping it prisoner, the spirit would be free at death. Why would it ever reincarnate? The fact is that the spirit is not free because the soul, or more precisely, the impure soul, restrains it and forces it to reincarnate. When the soul is pure, the spirit is finally free. When the spirit is free, it returns to God. This happens when one is alive, with the consolamentum. Then, when the person dies, the spirit is not reincarnated anymore. And the soul? The texts say nothing about the soul. Does it die? Does it dissolve? It's unknown, but it is no longer there. In summary, the fundamental difference between soul and spirit is this: the spirit is immortal because it is the spark of the divine. The soul, instead, survives death but is not immortal. The difficulty of this problem lies in the apparent contradiction, because it disconcerts the mind that something could survive death and not be immortal. A further difficulty comes from the fact that, in the Catholic religion, it is the soul that is considered immortal, and this concept has so entered into our normal language that even I, who well know the distinction between soul and spirit, sometimes use the term soul to indicate what, if we want to be rigorous, should always be called spirit. The distinction between soul and spirit is unequivocally present in the banquet and the comedy. In the banquet, the trick that Dante repeats is simple. The spirit is presented as a part of the soul. This way, he can make an absolutely orthodox statement and then assert the exact opposite. We should know firstly that man is composed of body and soul, but in the soul is that which, to be precise, is the divine goodness, that is, the spirit. And that he means the spirit and not a general divine goodness is clear, because a little further on he will speak of that part of our soul that never can die. So it is evident that there is a part of the soul that, page 108, dies, and another that doesn't. In the banquet, the spirit is identified with the mind, for the mind is understood as the last and most noble part of the soul. Mind is that last and most precious part of the soul that participates in the divine. In the comedy, the discourse is more complex because these same ideas are expressed in a much more veiled manner. In the chapter relating to creation, a long discourse has been recorded in which Beatrice lists the things created directly by God, which ends by saying, "The power to give form has been created. The rays and motion of the holy lights draw forth the soul of every animal and plant from matter able to take form." Paradise 7, 139 to 141. Beatrice's discourse wasn't finished. The tercet continues immediately by saying, "But your life is breathed forth without medium by the chief good, who so enamors it of his own self that it desires him always." Paradise 7, 142 to 144. Firstly, I would like to underline the presence, for the third time this canto, of the expression "without medium." As we have seen in the chapter dedicated to creation, Beatrice explained at the start of the chapter that only those things that were created without medium, that is to say directly, without intermediaries, by God, are free and immortal. The soul, I wouldn't say. Dante says it clearly in the preceding tercet. The soul is also possessed by animals and plants. Everything that lives has a soul, as well as man, not only man. But there is something distinctive about man. It is this that Dante calls life, a term that all the commentators translate as soul. Now, if on one hand it is correct and indeed appropriate to translate in current terms the language of Dante, on the other it is indispensable to respect the thought in it. It's enough to read the Banquet to understand what Dante means by life. When we say that a man lives, we understand this to mean that the man, page 109, employs his reason, which is his individual life and the actualization of his noblest faculty. Thus, he who forgoes his reason and merely utilizes his senses lives as a beast and not a man. And then, life in man is to use reason. And for where the term soul is concerned, it is certainly not by chance that it comes to be used here. In a key passage from the doctrinal point of view, the word soul for animals and plants. So to translate life as a soul constitutes a serious misinterpretation, or rather a manipulation of Dante's thinking. In Catholic doctrine, there are the body and the soul, and only men have souls. Not in Dante, for whom what distinguishes man from animals is certainly not the soul, but what God breathes, that is, as we shall soon see confirmed, the spirit, that he calls life in perfect harmony with the biblical account that says, "Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and man became a living being." It is curious that we today understand by life the vegetable and animal part, in no case the mind. But if we want to respect and understand the thoughts of our poet, we cannot translate life with soul, rather with spirit or mind. For Dante, only this part of the soul is created without medium by God, and therefore only this part is immortal. The soul, however, survives death. So Statius explains in Canto 25 of Purgatory, at the end of a long discourse in which he expounds the process of generation in man, within which recur the same terms used by Beatrice to describe the creation, informing virtue, soul, and spirit. Statius, however, doesn't talk about the creation of animals and plants, but that of man. He speaks about the fetus and how in it there is first the soul of a plant, vegetable soul, then it moves and feels, sensory soul, but it is to nature that all the members incline, that is, nature that bring the human organism to completion, soul included. The fetus, body and soul, passes through various stages in which it is still not properly human. In fact, Dante writes, but how the animal becomes a speaking being, you've not yet seen. Page 110. Open your heart to truth we have now reached, and know that, once the brain's articulation within the fetus has attained perfection, then the first mover turns towards it with joy on seeing so much art in nature, and breathes into it new spirit, vigorous, which draws all that is active in the fetus into its substance, and becomes one soul that lives and feels and has self-consciousness. Purgatory 25, 61 to 75. From the discourse of Stasius, it follows that the first moment in the formation of a human being is the soul, while the spirit is introduced in the second. So they are two different things. The spirit is also identified here with the reasoning soul, that is to say, with the mind. In these verses, it is said that the spirit is insufflated when the articulation of the cerebrum is complete, that is, at birth, as the Cathars claimed, or just before. In the same years Dante was writing his poem, the Council of Vienna, 1311 to 1312, had condemned as heretical this theory, and reiterated that the soul is breathed on by God at the moment of conception, something that the Church still believes today. So it is a further point on which the comedy corresponds fully with Cathar doctrine. Stasius's discourse passes directly from birth to death. When the man dies, this one soul is divided from the flesh, and virtually bears with it the human and divine. Purgatory 25, 80 to 81. It couldn't be expressed clearer than this. The soul is one thing, but it has a good 3 distinct parts. As in the banquet, page 111, the spirit, the divine, represents one part of the soul, that most precious part of the soul that participates in the divine. It is undeniable that not only the spirit survives death, but the whole soul, which is to say, also its human part, vegetative and sensory. Stasius says just this. He doesn't speak of immortality. It is Beatrice who speaks of it, and from the comparison of these two cantos, Purgatory 25 and Paradise 7, that treat of the same topic, however saying different things, it seems to be clear that Dante's thinking was heretical. Stasius says that the vegetative and sensory parts of the human soul survive death. Beatrice says they are not immortal. The two statements only appear to be contradictory. In reality, they are complementary and correspond to an ancient and traditional line of thinking, already expressed in the Timaeus, the one work of Plato known by Dante, in which it is said that with the exception of the part of the marrow destined to contain the divine seed and called the brain, all the rest of the marrow was destined to contain the remaining and mortal part of the soul. All the doctrines that preach reincarnation distinguish between an immortal soul, the spirit, and a mortal part of the soul. So it is for Hinduism, for Plato, and for the Cathars, and evidently it was also so for Dante.